All right, we're back. Episode 2, Healing Happens podcast, where we will continue our initial series of demystifying Instagram healing terminology. So once again, as I mentioned in the first episode when I discussed what healing means to me, some of these episodes will be much more my interpretation of these words, and then sometimes it'll be legit, this is the science, this is the facts, this is what it is. And today I'm going to be defining once and for all one of the most commonly used terms in Instagram, wellness, healing culture, which is nervous system regulation. What does this actually mean? All right, so here we go. We're gonna dive right in. So it is nearly impossible to open up Instagram if you're the type of person that listens to this podcast. I would imagine that both your Instagram and your TikTok feeds are flooded with people talking about nervous system regulation. Okay, now what actually is this? And I will admit, and I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this, I'm not gonna lie. I did not actually know the legit definition of this until I entered my somatic experiencing training. And I had been in the nervous system space for a really long time. And I always talked around nervous system regulation. I've always been really big on, the goal, quote unquote, I'm going to use the word intention because I don't like the word goal. The intention of healing is not to be calm and peaceful all the time. The intention of healing is to be able to hold whatever is in the container of your awareness without collapsing. The intention is to expand the window of tolerance so that more and more of your life experiences are in your range. And so I always knew this, and I was never, ever one to talk about how, parasympathetic activation is better, and we always want to be in rest and digest. Because also that's only half of the picture, Rest and digest is the way that the parasympathetic nervous system expresses when it feels safe, under conditions of safety. It is a very different picture when we're under threat, and that's something that's really important to acknowledge and keep in mind. So it's easy to open your Instagram feed or, go to one yoga class and hear rest and digest, stimulating the vagus nerve, parasympathetic activation, and be like, oh, yes, I've arrived. I'm like always in this state. Or, if I'm not always in this state, there's something wrong with me and I need to fix it and I'm doing it wrong. So that's not the intention. And even though I taught that that was not the intention, I didn't actually know, specifically the definition of nervous system regulation. So before I get to that, I want to say that a lot of people speak on the internet as if nervous system regulation were this state of always being calm, always being peaceful, always being in this kind of Zen mode. And that is 110% false. That is not what nervous system regulation is. If you are in that state constantly, it's likely that you're doing a lot of overriding of your nervous system's sympathetic activation, and you are likely in a state of freeze, collapse, or fawn. I'm not going to, again, get too deep into that. I really want to keep this about just very basic, what is nervous system regulation? So we've talked about what it's not. It is not constant parasympathetic activation. It is not being calm all the time. It is not never reacting to life. What nervous system regulation is being able to move through smooth cycles of up and down regulation. So said another way, it is moving through activation and settling cycles. And said yet another way, it is moving from a state of sympathetic activation to parasympathetic activation. Sympathetic activation, parasympathetic activation. So many of us have a default mode, and this usually comes from, whatever our body's sort of favorite or, chosen trauma response was in childhood. And I want to make really clear that majority of the time when I say the word choice or chosen, when I'm talking about trauma responses, I'm not talking about a conscious choice. I'm not saying that you were in a traumatic situation and you sat there and were like, okay, would it be best to fight, flight, freeze, or collapse? Like, what would be the best decision here? No, this is a subcortical choice. So I mentioned in episode 1, when I talked about healing, that our body is wired for survival. That is pretty much the whole purpose of the systems of the body, is to keep you alive. And that is the intention of your trauma response. Your body makes a split-second decision, subconscious choice, as to which of these methods is going to most effectively ensure your survival based on the perceived threat. So, if you are in an environment where fighting served you best, you're most likely going to be the kind of person that has, what we would call a short fuse. You're going to be easily triggered, a lot of things are gonna hype you up. You may, be giving the finger to people on the freeway a lot, things like road rage, or just those people that when you're around them, you're kind of walking on eggshells waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's a lot of fight energy in them. If your body determined that flight was the most effective trauma response for you most of the time, you might be the kind of person who is very jumpy, like constantly looking over your shoulder. You might be hyper aware of where the exits are around you. You might be the type of person who avoids conflict by just like exiting stage left. Every time a conflict arises, you're like, I'm out, I'm done. You might end a relationship for the sake of not having a conflict, things like this. Freeze or immobilization. These are the people that have a hard time standing up for themselves. Our voice, our words are one of the first fight responses. And so if you have a trouble setting boundaries or speaking up for yourself or speaking the truth, things like this, that might be a sign of freeze or immobilization. Or you may notice that your body physically freezes in situations where you are triggered or you're confronted. And then I'm not going to get too deep into like all these trauma responses, but collapse is a similar response. It's physiologically quite different than freeze, but that's beyond the scope of this podcast episode. I am probably going to do a workshop in the near future about freeze versus collapse, the differences in how they look, the differences in how to work with them, all that kind of stuff. And I also have a nervous system mini course on my YouTube channel if you would like to go check that out. There's more detail about all of this. But back to the regulation piece. So oftentimes we can get stuck on one side or the other. And so we have a hard time moving through these smooth cycles of up and down regulation. Another thing that can happen is that the cycles aren't so smooth. So we get super hyper aroused, like super sympathetic activation, and then we just absolutely crash. And then super arousal, and then super crash. And, we don't want these sharp peaks either, because that makes living life exhausting and very difficult. And so we want to be able to mobilize our sympathetic response when it's appropriate. And then we want to also be able to have tools to downregulate our system after the threat passes, or after we're done with vigorous exercise, or, to be able to go to sleep at night. And so there are mechanisms in the body that help us move through these cycles. So for example, our breath. An inhale is inherently activating to the sympathetic nervous system, while an exhale is inherently activating to the parasympathetic nervous system. So inhale, sympathetic; exhale, parasympathetic. So of course, this is subtle. This isn't extreme. It's not like you take an inhale and you're like, I'm gonna fight a bear. And when you exhale, you're like, I need a nap now. That would also make life very difficult to live. But in this case, it's just subtle sympathetic activation, subtle parasympathetic activation. And so if we know this, we can use this as a tool to help ourselves regulate. And again, regulation is the smooth transition from sympathetic to parasympathetic, sympathetic to parasympathetic. And so as we move through these cycles, if we find ourselves getting stuck in one spot, we can use techniques like the breath, like shaking, like different types of movement, like stimulating the vagus nerve, or, using sound and voice and toning and things like this, to move us through these cycles. So, if we are super tired, super parasympathetic, we need to get up and we need to mobilize and we have things to do, but we're having a hard time getting in touch with that sympathetic response, we can use vigorous breath work, or breath work that lengthens the inhale, that sympathetic side of the breath. On the other side, if we need to deactivate some of this sympathetic energy, we can do breathing techniques that are calming, soothing, grounding, or techniques where the exhale is longer than the inhale. So the entire idea here is to be able to move through these cycles of up and down regulation. So it really pains me to, and this podcast is not meant to be, just me talking smack about other practitioners or, the way other people present information, but it does really hurt me to the core to see so much misinformation about these topics out there, because it's confusing for people. If someone is made to believe and told and taught that nervous system regulation is being calm and zen and grounded all the time, if they're experiencing up and down cycles, activation and settling, they may feel like they're broken, or they're doing it wrong, or their healing's not working, or their techniques aren't working. And I really don't want that for anybody. I recently saw someone on Instagram, she's got like 50,000 followers, and she straight up said that the goal of healing is not nervous system regulation, because you don't want to be calm all the time. And then she went on to say that the goal is to move through cycles of up and down regulation, but that's not what regulation is. And I was like, okay. So just be really careful with the information that you're consuming out there, really consider the source when it comes to these things. But I do plan on talking about the nervous system quite a bit on the YouTube channel and the podcast, and particularly on YouTube, I will also be offering actual practices and techniques that you can practice alongside of me to help you learn how to regulate your own nervous system. And I want to be talking about these things, and so I want us to start from a firm foundation, and I want us to be really, really clear about what these things are and what they are not. because it's really important to have the right information as a starting point. I say this often, educating yourself on the nervous system is not healing. Having a bunch of head knowledge about how the nervous system works is not actually going to help you regulate. It's not actually going to help you heal your trauma. However, I do think that education is a really powerful and important and empowering starting point, because if you know how your system works, if you can notice where you get stuck, if you can identify your triggers, if you can learn these techniques and have an embodied experience with techniques to move through these cycles, then you can do the healing practices and integrate them in a much more meaningful way if you're aware of what's going on in your body. So I encourage you to get educated about trauma, the nervous system, healing, all, regulation, all the things that I just talked about. But even more than that, I encourage you to actually get on the mat, get with the practitioner, and do somatic healing work so that you can anchor in, embody, integrate, and actually release and deactivate the trauma that you hold inside of you. And that is how healing happens. All right, well, I will see you soon for episode 3. Thank you so much for following along for this little mini lesson about nervous system regulation, what it is, what it isn't, and how empowering education can be as you are walking into your healing journey. So I'll see you soon. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to reach out to me. You can comment on the YouTube video. You can ask questions there. You can also feel free to drop me a message on social media. I would absolutely love to connect with you further on this. So sending you all my love, and I'll connect with you again soon.